I sense a lot of energy in the room, and I bring good news. This is going to be a great panel or your money back. Folks, I'm Matthew Kahn, and on it was either January 7th or January 8th, I flew back from Hoover to Los Angeles, and I flew over the fires. And I made a video of it. I've shown it to my mother-in-law. She's asked me to stop showing it to her. And just the horror that this was just the beginning of the challenge for the LA region. It was the nudge, as I gently nudged Terry and Nick, that we have a panel on rare disasters and are worried that these disasters could become less rare. And how do we set up incentives? How do we use markets? Apparently, incentives matter. Folks, kind of a round of applause for incentives? How the critical role of markets in improving our quality of life, and especially during times of extreme risk. I want to live in an economy where flood risk and wildfire risk are less common, and a question of how we configure the rules of the game such to align incentives. I'm very worried that much of the LA disaster was man-made and an unintended consequence of many regulations with huge unintended consequences. So folks, if you Google my name and you Google Kahn and Kindle for an Inferno, you can see some of my Hoover thinking. But with that, I'm going to walk off the stage and bring in our great panelists. We're very lucky to have Margaret Walls from Resources for the Future and Judge Boomhower from UC San Diego. And the way we're going to set this up is Margaret's going to kick this off, and she has great slides. I'm going to stay awake, and then we're going to, when we hit slide 5, roughly, Judd is going to chime in, and our discussion is going to begin. Margaret.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks so much to the organizers. Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Matt, for setting us up here for success, hopefully. Yeah, I only have a few slides, so I'm just going to sit here. I hope that's okay. And I want to start with this. I hope this isn't triggering for anybody. Apologies if so. But on the left is a photo of Asheville, North Carolina, and on the right is Altadena, California. And I put this up for 2 reasons. Both of these were very unusual events, and I'm sure everybody here probably knows why, but Asheville, North Carolina is nowhere near the coast, 400 miles from the coast, and yet that's the effects of a hurricane. The Altadena picture, the LA fires, were unusual because they occurred in January, well after fire season, not what's traditional fire season. The state of California has 9-month contracts for their firefighters. They wouldn't even have firefighters ready to go. So, you know, things are happening at weird times in weird places, and with something we all need to be thinking about. So here's a couple of things I'm going to set the stage with. This is a map of the US, and this is from a blog series that I did with my colleague Penny Lau. And we took the raw extreme events database called Storm Events Database that NOAA puts together and created a county panel data set of all extreme events. These are not just disasters. These are any extreme weather event that gets noted by NOAA and some sort of cost. Property damages, crop damages, fatalities, and injuries are the 4 things that they tally up, and they have about 50 different categories of different kinds of events, you know, ice storms and avalanches, and we sort of created a more limited set. We had like 10 different categories, and you know, we made this data available to anybody to use, so if you're familiar with the Shieldus data, it's basically we just did what they do, and they sell it for money. So anyway, this is a map of property damages from extreme weather events by county over about a 28-year period. And I put it up here to show, of course, where do we have the problem in this country? And clearly, it's a Gulf Coast, Florida kind of situation where those of the counties where damages are the greatest. That shouldn't come as a great surprise. There's 2 reasons for that. One is hurricanes are the most damaging event that we have. And secondly, a lot of people live down there, and there's a lot of property. So you also see some dark colors in Southern California and up in the East Coast. We have a map that's a per capita version of this map. It still looks pretty similar. The Gulf region is still the highest, but the Midwest has a big swath of dark, and the coasts kind of go away. So yeah, this is where we have the problems. However, I want to tell you what's on the list from highest to lowest. So the top county in damages over this period is Harris County, Texas. That's Houston. This number 2 on the list is Galveston, Texas. Also, prime hurricane country. But where is number 3 is Butte County, California, which has a population of about 215,000 people. And so this was a shocker to me, but y'all know what happened in Butte County, that's the Camp Fire. So this is another way of showing the data. There's Harris County and Galveston County and Butte County. So these are the counties ranked from highest damages to lowest, and there's just 15 on the list here. And what the point here is showing, so this is showing the data at every year of the panel from 95 through 2022. And the point here is the spikes, right? A single event can push a county to the top of the list, essentially. So that Camp Fire in 2018 pushed Butte County very high on the list. I mean, wildfires are not usually damaging events. Most wildfires occur off in the boonies, right? They can be millions of acres, but they're not near where people live. But the Camp Fire went through the town of Paradise, and if we redo this data, LA is going to be very high on this list, right? So I think the point to me is, it's this point about a single event. If you look at numbers 4 or 5 on the list, those are New Jersey counties. That's Hurricane Sandy that's causing that. And a kind of a lesson I think take away is that really no place is immune to these changes that are occurring. I mean, obviously you're less at risk in certain places than you are in others, but climate change is creating more floods and more wildfires for various reasons, and we can debate that if you want. I'm happy to do that, but I'm not going to go into it right now. Okay, so that's, here's the last slide I'm going to put up, and then we're just going to chat. Matt's going to ask us some questions. And we're going to come back to this, but I wanted to put up this kind of little simple equation. And this is kind of an engineering definition of risk, but oftentimes is used. What do we mean by disaster risk? We mean the probability of an event, which is typically what's called the hazard, multiplied by the exposure, how much property and how many people are in harm's way, times the vulnerability. So the vulnerability is the propensity of the buildings and the people to incur some sort of damage. So vulnerability was always used in an engineering sense, like how strong is your structure is a measure of vulnerability. Increasingly, it gets used in a social sense, like certain populations are more prone can't recover from an event as easily as others. But in any case, it's worth kind of considering all these 3 components. If we're going to tackle the problem, we have to recognize that we can reduce the hazard by building a levee for flood or defensible space or a fuel break in our forests. Or we can talk about where people live, which I think we're going to come back to in a minute. But I'm just going to leave this up here, and I'll stop talking.
Margaret, thank you. That was fantastic, and it's going to tee up Judd after I crack a joke. So, folks, if I had a tattoo, it would be that equation.
Oh, come on.
Well, it would be that or, well, I won't say. Folks, I'm fascinated by all 3 terms. Some of my work is about that exposure term. If we see people moving to one of these disaster areas, my teacher, Gary Becker, would say, why? Is it that they are unaware of the risk in those areas? Or is it that we have zoned for single-family housing in safer areas, deflecting people into fire zones? Or is it that insurance is subsidized by certain government entities, encouraging people to move to those areas? And so I am fascinated by, are we passive victims? Or what are we aware of? And I'm going to set up Judd. Roger Pilkey Jr. talks about the bullseye effect, that one of the reasons that damages from disasters are rising is that more and more of us are located in Margaret's exposure box of why and under what different incentives. How do we use markets to give people more freedom to live where they want to live? So Judd, to tee this up for you, how, in your exciting work on wildfire adaptation, can you walk us through how you're thinking about these 3 terms and how does your work link to those terms?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I absolutely can. I have been spending a lot of time with that equation recently, so I'm really happy you put that up, Margaret. Before I get us there, I'm going to do like 1 minute of higher level stuff because I am, for better or for worse, a college professor, so I get uncomfortable if I don't get to give my little mini lecture. So yeah, I'm an economics professor. I'm at UC San Diego. I have been thinking, like Matt, I've been thinking a lot about climate adaptation in the last 10-ish years, and thinking about the role of private markets and the role of governments in achieving efficient climate adaptation. And a lot of that work has been specifically focused on wildfires. I think I've written like 7 or 8 wildfire research papers now, which was not necessarily on purpose, but there are a lot of reasons. It's personally an interesting topic to me. I grew up in the West. It's of course like inherently important, as we saw in LA, but we know that this hazard is becoming more important. It's also, though, just like a really great laboratory for learning about severe weather risk and climate change risk more broadly, right? And I think that's why maybe we should all be particularly interested in this discussion and what we can learn from it, in addition to just the importance of wildfire. So I promise I'm going to end on that equation. But when you think about the fact that we have the weather risks that Margaret told us about that are getting so much worse. We know the reasons. We know it's because, as Matt said, we've concentrated assets in places that are at risk of loss. We've also built those assets during a historical period when we just didn't think about these risks in the same way that we think about them today, and when the risks weren't as important as they are today. And so we built them in ways that we probably wouldn't build them if we were going to rebuild them today. And when we're thinking about fire specifically, at least in some landscapes, we've made decisions about excluding fire from the landscape in historical years that have, are coming back to bite us a little bit today in terms of bigger, more intense fires. So what do we do? What's the answer? I think it's easy I can tell you where we want to end up, right? I think where we want to end up, and I'll say this is going to be from the perspective of, I'm giving you a very Southern California perspective right now, kind of unapologetically. So I'm going to talk a lot about protecting private built assets from fire. Basically, I'm talking about homes and businesses, and most of what I'm going to talk about is going to ignore timber. It's going to ignore air quality impacts of smoke, which are also really important. But luckily, we have some other panels about public lands management that are going to at least hopefully touch on the timber risk. From the perspective of protecting houses, which is what we spend a lot of time thinking about in fire, I think we want to end up in a world where we do 2 things really well. One, we fix the physical protection problem. So we invest in hardening structures or building new structures in a way that makes them less vulnerable, to get to Margaret's point. We focus on that vulnerability component. Exactly how much would we like to be investing? We'd like to be making those vulnerability investments up to the point where the marginal additional dollar spent reducing vulnerability is equal to the social marginal benefits in terms of reduced losses. It's not going to be cost effective to mitigate away all the wildfire risk or all the flood risk or all the hail risk or the what have you risk. And so the other challenge that we want to figure out is we want to handle all the residual remaining risk after we do physical mitigation well with financial protection, right? And that means insurance. That means we want well-functioning insurance markets that can handle that residual risk. And in some way, like if you don't think too hard about the problem, it's relatively easy just to stop there and say, okay, and set insurance prices actuarially fair plus some load to cover costs, and we're off to the races and we're good. Let me tell you a couple reasons that I think that's hard, and then I'll let Matt take us where he wants to take us. There are, on the physical margin, there are a few factors that complicate that investment. One is that we know there's important neighbor spillovers. So Dean Luke is a Santa Barbara researcher who's been affiliated with PERC at various times, has a very nice book about the economics of wildfire. And one of the key themes of that book is you have these property spillovers and wildfire mitigation risk. In urban settings in particular, where you have a lot of parties who have to try and figure out those negotiations, that challenges your Coasian interpretation. Then on the financial side, I think it's even harder. Let me tell you a few things that we got to confront with insurance markets. Of course, we have state level regulation of insurance, and it's an easy job to beat up on things that California has done or things that Florida have done and how they've regulated insurance. And it's not hard to sort of take shots and think about ways that those regulations may potentially reduce the incentive for insurers to participate or other things. I think that's not the entire problem, though. There's also really important information problems that we'll talk about. There's really real monitoring frictions and verification frictions that make this a harder problem. And the one that I hope we can spend a little bit of time talking about, this is catastrophic risk. So wildfire and flood and hurricane risk are fundamentally different from all these places that we think about. My colleagues in Applied Micro have written hundreds and hundreds of studies about insurance market, life insurance and health markets. And in those markets, we don't have the problem that we have in these markets where one event can trigger enormous payouts all at once, and that creates all kinds of additional costs for insurers. Okay, so I will leave my rant there. Thank you for letting me do my rant, and I'll pass it back to Matt.
Judd, thank you. So we need to inject some amphetamines into this room. And so let's do it like this. Judd, you may not be aware of this, you have a very exciting Oregon field experiment that you are writing. Can you tell this room about your work, or do you want me to do it?
Yeah, so what we're doing in Oregon is inspired by, one way of thinking about what we're doing in Oregon is we want to understand what property level mitigation investment for wildfire protection could potentially look like in a world where sometime in the near future, technological advances and regulatory changes make it possible for insurers to engage in high frequency pricing of homeowner behaviors to protect their homes from wildfire. So think about managing vegetation between 0 and 5 feet from the structure. Think about trimming tree branches away from the roof. We can have a discussion about why insurers don't adjust for those things right now. The motivation for this experiment in Oregon is just like, what would the world look like if they did? And our very humble way of getting at that is we're running a field experiment where we've randomly selected we've partnered with a couple different fire districts in Oregon, randomly selected some property owners, and offered them small amounts of money if they will take certain actions that the fire department thinks will reduce their fire risk. And then it's a field experiment, so we have a control group that we don't offer any money to. We keep track of what they're doing as well, and then we have an information group where we send them letters about how important wildfire risk is, but we don't offer them any money. And I think everyone in this room will not be surprised to find out that the money spurs more mitigation investment than the lack of money. On the other hand, the money does not massively move the scale. Our preliminary results are that we're getting between 5 and 10% of the people that we hit with this payment. So is that a big response or not? You tell me.
So I think it's terrific. Before I set up Margaret, my optimism here is as more individuals in these fire zones are aware of the risks they face, of the entrepreneurship. We talked about Hoover's environmental entrepreneurs, of the opportunities for entities that cost effectively mitigate flood and fire risk. And there's folks in the room working on these issues. And so we know we got Rogaine because there were a bunch of bald guys, I'm looking around, who were willing to pay for this. We're going to see something similar in terms of adapting to climate change. So I debate many people who implicitly assume this stationarity, that we've got our menu of strategies to adapt to wildfire risk and flood risk. And to me, that's baloney. The Hayek magic of capitalism is the continuous, sloppy, messy innovation that occurs, and necessary steps are for unknown unknowns to become known unknowns. And so First Street Foundation and these other entities with their art/science models of risk play this role of Paul Revere, waking people up. Margaret, with that, I want to thank you for your patience with us. And can we do
you want me to go on?
Please do.
Okay. Well, let's talk about exposure a bit more. Okay. Let me say something about this. So what can we do about this part of the problem is what I want to talk about for a minute. And how much should we try to do, I think, is a really big question. And to me, a huge issue that communities face, and Judd can tell me if he agrees with this, is what are we going to do? How much do we want to buy out properties or rezone so we don't develop where we shouldn't be developing? Or in coastal areas, how much do we want to retreat? And how much do we want to invest in hazard mitigation or to ask, homeowners to do certain things? Like the mix of whether we want to stay and make our community a thriving, vibrant community, but we have to make investments to, reduce this problem, versus retreat is a huge, huge question. And so how much should we try to do, to me, is a really big question. So with that, I want to just tell you about an interesting policy experiment that my colleagues and I did a study of. And anybody in this room heard of the Coastal Barrier Resources System? Holly's nodding because I know she knows, but I love telling everybody about it, so you're going to hear about it. So this was created by federal legislation in 1982, the Coastal Barrier Resources Act, and it's a system of lands, mostly along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. They now have some in the Great Lakes, but it's not on the West Coast. It's just the hurricane-prone areas or tropical storm areas. And it's been expanded to over time, including in November, when there was a addition to the system, significant one. And on these lands, you are not eligible to buy federal flood insurance. You will not get federal disaster aid if a disaster strikes, and the federal government spends no money on infrastructure. So they have removed incentives to develop. And that's a cut and paste from the legislation. I just read a little bit of it. The Congress declares, and this is from 1982, that it is the purpose of this act to minimize loss of human life, wasteful expenditure of federal revenues, and the damage to fish, wildlife, and other natural resources associated with the coastal barriers along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast by restricting future federal expenditures and financial assistance which have the effect of encouraging development. So that's what they set out to do, is let's not develop these lands. So we did here's a couple pictures of them just as examples. So they have a very extensive online mapper. You can go look at where all these, they call them units, are. The one on the right is the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Up at the northern end, the road ends, the paved road ends, and there are still houses up there. And that's a photo. So I don't know if anybody's from that part of the world has been there, but it's a popular vacation destination. And that's Kiowa Island in South Carolina, which is a lovely spot if you've ever been. And they have some units there too. They're all over. And some of them are conservation lands. They've been protected, but most of them are privately owned lands. So we did a comprehensive analysis, and you can go read it in Nature Climate Change with my colleagues and I, Hannah Druckenmiller, who's now at Caltech, Penny Lau, who's my colleague, Sophie Pesic, who was an RA and is a grad student now, and Shan Zhang, who was our intern and who's now at Old Dominion University. So I want to give a shout out to everybody. So what did we find? I won't go into all the techniques that we used because it's very difficult and challenging to analyze the effects because these lands were very carefully selected. So you cannot just go compare them to every other coastal land. You have to do a very careful treatment control kind of analysis and design of your experiment. So on the CBRS lands, we found there were 83% fewer buildings per acre, 41% reduction in a developed land area. So basically, far less. Without the law, there would have been way more development than there was. And then we also looked at neighboring lands. What happened in the areas around these units? And we found that they had generated a lot of change in those areas as well. It increased development on those lands, it increased property values, and it reduced flood damages. So some back of the envelope-ish kind of numbers in that blue box. We calculated savings to the National Flood Insurance Program of $930 million a year. Okay, so that's because you can't get a policy on the CBRS lands if you have a house. And on the other lands, even though there's more development, there was less flood claims per acre, so, and per dollars of coverage. So on net, there's a savings to the program. And one of the things people care a lot about is what's going to happen to local property tax revenues if we're not developing. Like, communities obviously really care about this, right? That's why they don't like buyouts. They want to get their property taxes. And what we found is actually increased property taxes. And again, because you're losing some value and losing development on those lands, but you're getting benefits behind. So on the whole, a very successful policy experiment. And so a question I'll pose to everybody here is, can we just make this bigger? Like, could we have even more lands in the system? Or could we use this kind of approach somewhere else, like high wildfire risk areas? We don't have the federal flood insurance program there, but, and let me just say this and I'll stop talking, but we don't know which of those three carrots that were taken away are really driving these outcomes, right? We're just looking at the, the counterfactual and comparing. Is it the infrastructure? Is it the flood insurance? Is it the disaster aid? Most people that know things about the program think probably the biggest thing is not the flood insurance, but the infrastructure spending. So could we do something there? Because when we put infrastructure in, we induce development in locations, right? So we need to think about that in high-risk areas.
Margaret, thank you. And I highly recommend her paper. Margaret, a slight libertarian question. Is the NFIP crowding out private insurance? That I keep writing on my Substack that the insurance industry could be the adult in the room if state insurers didn't put price caps on insurance. And so the question I want to ask is, as our budget deficit continues to rise at the federal level, could a Trump administration phase out the NFIP, or is that naive politics?
Okay, well, a little history.
Would this unleash the private sector and markets?
That's been unleashed. 22% of flood insurance is private now, and that's most people attribute to the rise in the rates with risk rating 2.0. So national flood insurance policies have gotten more expensive, and as a result, there's been a boost in the private market. Private flood insurance. I will point out historical information here. The reason we have a national flood insurance program is because the private sector stepped out of providing flood insurance in the 20s. So we haven't had, the private insurers did not provide flood insurance since that day. And in the late 60s, we came up with the federal program. So, now are things flipping back, perhaps?
So that actually, Margaret, thank you. And so a question for both of you. With the rise of the information technology revolution, so Judd has done some terrific co-authored work on that older vintages of housing face greater wildfire risk. We have better and better big data allowing insurers to engage in something called price discrimination. And this could raise their profitability relative to insurers in the 1920s. So Judd, with your work that older properties in California face more fire risk, should these grannies in these homes, can we price gouge them and charge them more for insurance, but give them a discount if they update their roof from Led Zeppelin's time in the 1970s?
And the market is going that way. So homeowners insurance has for a long time differentiated prices according to the age of the home. Presumably that reflects differences in wildfire risk as well as lots of other risk factors, like the plumbing is less likely to break. You're seeing a move in the market towards more granularity in pricing. Interestingly, in California, you're seeing regulations that require insurers to do what Matt is talking about. So a very interesting conversation for a room of people that love markets is to think about why do you need a regulation? Or first of all, do you want a regulation that is requiring that? And if we agree with Matt that we want this differentiation in pricing, why is it that the market is not converging on that equilibrium on its own? Is it something about a lack of confidence in exactly the difference in risk that's attributable to 1/8-inch mesh over the vents versus wood siding versus lack of vegetation in the first 5 feet? Is it the fact that we know we have, like maybe we know how much safer those homes are that have those characteristics, but it's very expensive to send an inspector out to every individual home and inspect that home and verify that it has those assets. And by the way, these are like, from the perspective of a national property insurer, one home is a really small slice of business. So I think, as soon as you make underwriting that home even a little bit more expensive, you do change the business decision. So yes, I think there's a lot of room to think about tailoring insurance pricing more closely to follow risk, but there are like real challenges and we got to figure out what are the important sort of limiting factors and how do we get over them.
I agree. And from a competitive point of view, if there's an insurer who is innovative here, we would hope that they would earn greater profits. So Judd, in the case of California wildfires, maybe you're going to say State Farm, is there an insurer who is innovating here the most, or does Ricardo Lara's price ceilings represent an implicit tax on innovation here?
Well, I mean, across the industry, and not just in wildfire, you've seen a move across property insurers to taking these risks more seriously and investing and understanding how to price them and how to decide where they want to do business and where they don't want to do business. So yeah, I think you're seeing lots more attention. You're seeing innovation. One fun conversation that we can have, it would be about, to the extent that we're seeing innovation by private companies and how to price these risks. So you mentioned First Street. First Street is an kind of public-spirited, kind of private business that produces maps of fire risk and flood risk and other things. They have competitors, the AAR, CoreLogic, RMS. There's a lot of companies that engage in this innovation, as well as things that are happening inside the insurers as well. To what extent do we think that's the innovation process that's going to take us where we want to go versus? And by the way, all of those things build on publicly funded scientific research, right? That happens at places like Stanford. So there's work from the U.S. Geological Survey, from NOAA, that creates a lot of the basic scientific data that goes into those models. Do we have it sort of about right now in terms of the amount of innovation in modeling weather risk that happens in universities and then the amount that happens out in the private sector? And does that create the right profit incentives for everyone to invest and compete to have the best model and make a lot of money and cream skim the best insurance customers or sell their model for the highest price to the insurance companies? Maybe. There's room for really serious research about whether we've got that boundary right in terms of how much is happening in universities and how much is happening out in the private sector. And there are Matt and I have kind of chatted before about open source software versus Microsoft Word, and is there an analog here? That's one conversation we can have.
Matt, can I say something about the insurance market? In coastal areas, for the most part, on the East Coast now, and Florida for sure, everybody's not getting their insurance from the State Farms of the world. It is niche providers. And one concern is that, there's a lot of bankruptcies. Florida's had a lot of bankruptcies. There's a lot of providers that have very few customers. So, how are they covering those? There's a lot of questions about the structure of the market, I think.
So I want to pick up on Margaret's point and then ask Margaret a question. So folks, if you go to a restaurant, you immediately know the next day if you've been poisoned and whether it's a bad meal. Do I need to elaborate? But in the case of insurance, with rare events, if you only file a claim once a decade, how do you know that Allstate, that they're there for you? So I watch a lot of basketball, and so there's the insurance ad that always has the same guy saying that he's so nice. But how do we know until a disaster occurs whether your insurance will insure?
This is why Florida has set up their program, which covers if there is a bankruptcy or if they can't cover, the state of Florida will cover you. So they have a little surcharge on all the providers, and that goes into a fund, and they cover that very problem you're talking
So
about.
that's a fiscal externality. So I wish we lived in Milton Friedman's world where a quality service provider, that's common knowledge, and he or she can charge a price premium for that because of excellent service. So after a disaster that you get your check the next day, you're not asked to itemize all your jewelry and all your tattoos. Margaret, my final question before I open this up. In Asheville, North Carolina, that recent disaster where it flooded in a place that had never flooded before, I debate many young economists on themes from behavioral economics. I'm the last of the rational expectations economists. In the case of flood risk, is it your belief as an economist, that as a thinker, that people systematically underestimate these risks? Or I've been interested in how much do themes from behavioral economics slow down climate change adaptation. So Richard Thaler won the Nobel Prize in economics, and sort of cliche is modeling people as Homer Simpson, of blissfully unaware of risks that are emerging, while I model people as Mr. Spock from Star Trek. So Margaret, as you think about flooding, a cliche of what percentage of home buyers these days are Homer versus Mr. Spock, and what can First Street Foundation and other entities do to help people to update their beliefs so that we don't have buyer beware, buyer regret?
Well, that's the $64 million question or whatever. I don't want to say they've never flooded in Asheville, because Appalachia is very prone to flooding problems. So I think they definitely had floods. But the one county that had had a hurricane before was the only county that had evacuation routes set up ahead of time. I found that sort of interesting. That was in a news story. You know, they were so unprepared for anything like that, and it was very, very devastating. By the way, Hurricane Helene killed more people than any other hurricane in mainland U.S. than Katrina. So, I mean, this was a very bad hurricane, so just wanted to put that out there. So to your point, this problem, Matt, of like, do people understand the risks and make choices based on the risk, isn't that what you're asking, is a really knotty problem that people have been struggling with for a long time. You know, people misinterpret what a floodplain map is. All it is the mandatory area where you have to have flood insurance if you have a mortgage, federally backed mortgage. It doesn't mean that sharp line says you have no risk outside that area and inside, you know, so people interpret it that way. And lots of other information failures. I don't know what Judd thinks about this, but there's a real question about how people can interpret complicated risks. You know, in flood, we talk about return periods. Nobody knows what a return period is. Nobody knows what a 1 in 100 year flood really means. So it's a challenge. And one idea on that front, I think the First Street thing and having it in your real estate listing, some measure of risk, it's still just like an index number or something, is a good thing for sure. One idea people have had is to present things in dollar terms instead of return periods or probabilities or whatever. This is how much damage you will have, you know, if this event occurs or something like that. Something that's more a cost-based thing.
And Judd, on this point, am I right that with wildfires we actually get negative correlation? So if we burn down the trees, then wildfire is less likely going forward. Do people understand this negative autocorrelation? That was a joke.
That's right, and thank you, I wouldn't have caught it. That's correct. It's particularly correct in certain types of ecosystems that are more forest. It's less correct where I live in SoCal. But yeah, I mean, to what both of you are saying, I think the data that I've seen suggests that today or recently when these surveys were done, people don't understand disaster risk very well. But Matt's question is, are they going to understand it better going forward, and to what extent? And I think we got to figure that out. I don't think we know the answer.
So folks, with that, we have 7 minutes. Say what you want about me, but I make my point and I shut up. Questions? Terry.
Well, first off, don't feel badly about not getting Matt's jokes. There are about 100 people here who also miss most of it. So.
Tough room.
I want to go back to the morning discussion in Gary Leibkap's presentation and Ronald Coase. I wish climate issues had come up when I could speak to Ronald, because I'd say to him, is there a property rights problem? My argument is no. There's a well-functioning real estate market, and absent the regulations in the insurance market, a well-functioning insurance market. Now, but that's not a property rights. The malfunctions in, if there are malfunctions in the insurance market, that's not a property rights problem. These homeowners have the two markets that produce information, and I have a right to drive my Ford F-250. So I don't know why markets wouldn't handle that. I mean,
Can I ask sorry, I didn't mean to step on.
Well, so why wouldn't markets handle that? Why do we need regulations about where people build on coastal barrier islands? And why do we need regulations on insurance? It seems like both those cases, absent interventions that tell you can't build there. I can understand if I live there and my house is there, I'd like none of you to move there. But I don't quite see where the market failure is, where the Kosian problem is, and so I'm just sort of befuddled by this whole discussion. And it comes back to Matt's point about the middle term there. As soon as you said that, then I started thinking, well, housing prices fit in. Why do I move here? Well, they're low-priced houses. Now, I can find out about whether there are floods or fires or whatever, but I might still choose to move there. So the people part of that equation goes up due to prices enough.
I mean, to me, one of the biggest things is you don't live somewhere in isolation. The local government has put water and sewer and electricity and provides infrastructure, roads. Somebody's facilitating you living in a place, and that's government money at work. So I guess we could take that out of the equation, but having said that, there are costs to local and state governments, federal government too, I guess, of that infrastructure, of maintaining it, and those are challenges right now. So I guess to the point of like, why do we need to tell people not to live there? Or we're not telling them not to live there, but we've taken away those incentives, and that's what's happened. I guess it's that. It's like we do have government spending money on infrastructure.
I want to add a point there. The Nobel laureate Kitlin and Prescott would argue that the government can't commit to not bail out, so that some folks move to the area flipping a one-sided coin, that if nothing bad happens, they're like Jerry Seinfeld in the Hamptons. But if something terrible happens, there will be a government bailout. I take Terry's point. Steve?
Can I, Terry? You got us all really excited. So I'm gonna say one more thing, and you make a lot of really interesting points about why we may or may not need zoning, or that we don't need zoning, and that we can have a longer conversation about that. But I want to kind of stipulate everything that you said, and here's something that I haven't been able to figure out, that it seems like markets aren't fixing, and I don't see an obvious government intervention that's preventing markets from fixing it. Every insurer that I talk to tells me that they're very worried about managing their concentration in areas of high disaster hazard. In a world of functioning reinsurance, that shouldn't be a problem. There's these large, globally diversified pools of capital that should be able to take on that tail risk, and it has a very nice beta against other things that they're invested in. For some reason, and I don't think, if there's a government barrier there, tell me what it is, but it seems like there is something happening in the market for tail risk transfer that isn't, it's not working. It's not, or the price is substantially higher than you think it would be. And so there's some, at a minimum, I would say maybe
that will be solved going forward. That's not a
There's a lot of money. There's a lot of money on the table for somebody to solve that, but there's been a lot of money on the table for somebody to solve that for a long time. And so there's a real mystery there. And if you figure it out, either go make a lot of money or come talk to me and we can write a research paper about it.
Steve?
So
But the real estate market, that's all part of this too. So you've got this problem on the insurance side, but my prediction would be that house prices in that area are going to be lower and reflect the fact I can't get insurance. So I agree. I just think in
that we're not living in the best possible world in that case, because why can't we have well-functioning insurance that allows us to manage this risk in a better way instead of just loading it on the people who kind of get caught holding the bag with these high-risk properties. But I see your point.
Steve, your
Markets-
final
So
thought.
I find all this
versus mandates
economics
is the question.
really fascinating, but I want to come back to the underlying hazard and the climate science, and in particular say I find the attribution of the Asheville event to climate change, or at least anthropogenic climate change, problematic for two reasons. One is that if you refer to the famous 12.12 table that Scott Tinker talked about this morning, you'll find that IPCC finds no long-term trend in the frequency or intensity of hurricanes, and the data in the Atlantic Basin over a century or more bear that out. Secondly, with respect to the Asheville event particularly, if you go back to 1916, in October of that year, you will find 14 inches of rain delivered in 2 days to Asheville, the same as what happened during Helene, when human influences on the climate were less than a fifth of what they are today. So we have a very short memory for weather events, and it's a little bit facile to say climate change for every extreme event that we see.
Oh, I certainly agree, but I don't think that's the point of the panel here.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I heard climate change several times with respect to the extreme.
Well, I think there's some attribution of some events for sure. I think sea level rise, absolutely.
We're not
I think,
talking about that. We're talking about storms and fires here.
yeah, and fires there is too, evidence.
The long-term drought series in California over several centuries shows no long-term trend either.
Most of the scientists that I would say that, I'm an economist. The scientific consensus that I'm familiar with suggests that the rise in wildfire risk is a combination of more development in dangerous places, potentially for forest management, and really important contribution from a changing climate as well.
We can look at the data. Let's do that.
Folks, in the name of keeping us on time, the clock has struck 0. But I told you this was going to be a great session. And buyer's regret, thank you very much.
I don't think we ended on